Chapter 44, Faith in Chaos. December 25th, 2086. Orlando, Florida. For a brief moment, the brilliant flash of a nuclear explosion lit up the devastated landscape around Orlando. Then, about a minute later, a painfully loud crack rent the air. For many of the survivors, it was a signal of recent developments. General McCavity and his troops must have just reached Canaveral, said Blake Robinson. If we're going to get those birds in the air, it's now or never. At his words, a group of mutons turned and moved quickly to their next project. Blake was standing on what used to be one of the runways at Orlando International Spaceport. Like the rest of the city, it was devastated by Akira's attack and in no fit state to be used. But it was being used anyway. What few starships remained intact were being frantically prepared for launch. Most of their crews were survivors from the pirate ship Ashoka, augmented by the local population of mutons and andromedons. As he looked around, Blake took account. There were 15 ships total, 4 Partogan starfighters, a pair of Blorg multi-role jets, a Tidani bomber, a Skildari gunship, half a dozen contingency vessels, and the JSDF Archangel. Blake could not help but feel a little bit of pride at the sight of the old spaceplane. Himawari and Chris Wright were hard at work on the vessel, helping a pair of mutons rearm her energy cannons. This old bird just refuses to die, doesn't she? He said as he approached. You could say the same for the woman who used to own this thing, Chris replied. He closed the access hatch and brought the dorsal energy cannon back online before looking at Blake. The two men shared a smile. Last time we saw each other, everyone was calling you History Dude or something like that, Blake commented. Has it really been 4 years? Feels like longer, Chris replied. And yeah, they still call me that. They both paused to admire the old spaceplane. This might be her last flight, Chris remarked. Sure you don't want to come along? Someone has to stay here and play traffic cop, Blake replied. Friendly forces are starting to pour into the city now. Someone has to stay and point them towards Canaveral. I think that is doing all of the pointing for you now, Chris said, pointing towards the dimly lit mushroom cloud, faintly visible on the dark horizon. But it's almost time to go. Our pilot just got here. A slow-moving pickup truck turned to drive down the runway, and Randall Murphy jumped down from the bed as it moved off. Himawari let out a cry of joy at the sight of him, and the ex-couple shared a tight hug. I was in the next town over when it all happened, Randall explained, in both English and sign language. I was trying to use the hyperwave in Claremont to call our daughter, but she wouldn't pick up. Randall was talking about Sophie Murphy. Blake had a general idea of where his grandchild was and spoke up. The last I heard, Sophie was at Cape Canaveral, he said. She is there of her own free will. My son, Marcus, said she was drawn into Etienne's orbit more effectively than he was. Himawari and Randall both shuddered. Randall started to ask where Marcus was, but Himawari cut him off with a firm gesture. Then they both decided to take action. Spread the word, Himawari signed to her father. All ships will take off and follow the Archangel to Canaveral. We'll give McCavity and Inez whatever air support they need. About an hour and a half before sunrise, 15 starships lifted off from the ruins of Orlando and started to speed east. Meanwhile, on the ground below, hundreds of Batera warforms were marching in the same direction. Behind them was a collection of humans, hybrids, and aliens that slowly coalesced into a ragtag army as they went. Nearly 1,000 fighters, armed with whatever they could find, moved in the direction of Canaveral. There was no organization, no central leader. Everyone simply knew where they needed to go and what needed to be done. As the haphazard force moved out, Blake turned back to the city, where thousands of men and women were frantically digging into the rubble, crying out to the survivors trapped below. Blake prayed that Jericho would be found soon, and that McCavity's convoy could hold out until she arrived. Meanwhile, the 29 defenders reconvened on the ground floor of the Canaveral VAB. Victoria looked badly shaken and in no condition to fight. "General McCavity is dead," Kingi reported, along with a whole regiment of GDF troops and equipment. Silence hung over the defenders. Corder and Munkustrap twitched their ears, listening to the enemy just outside. Nainu ran to the north wall and dared to peek through one of the bullet holes. "I saw Sky Rangers flying away, heading out to sea," Nainu reported back. "Probably going to the boats," Inez explained. "There are 2 ways Canaveral is supplied, by air and by sea. Mom is probably sending someone to get more soldiers from the boats and offshore platforms nearby." "We're already outnumbered. Why is the Paradox going for reinforcements?" asked Carfu. "Because she knows her advantage won't last," Emmanuel answered. The professor gave everyone a meaningful look. "The GDF is still present in large numbers throughout the solar system," he went on, "and the UN government is coming around to our side. The Paradox is racing the clock. The longer we hold out, the more friendly forces are going to come racing to Canaveral. We're doing good by keeping her tied down like this. We just need to keep her focus on us." "Yeah, but if we keep the fight on ourselves, we'll risk hurting those kids," Emma von Richthofen said, gesturing to the bunker. "I won't trust that bunker to another bombardment. We just can't count on getting lucky twice. No offense, kid." Cassandra put her hands behind her back and looked away from Emma. Munkustrap raised a paw and put an end to the conversation. "Those of you with sharp ears, listen," he said. "The enemy is getting ready to come again. They're going to have us surrounded in just a few moments." "We can't hold this building again," Colonel Sharp protested. "If we try to defend it, it'll come down on top of us. We've got to go somewhere else." At that moment, Inez was very suddenly reminded of the night she escaped from Cape Canaveral with her father and sister. They had gone south towards Port Canaveral and Cocoa Beach. She strained her memory, trying to remember any landmarks along the route, and one came to mind at once. Inez acted on the thought quickly. "Everyone listen up," she said. "We've got to attack now while they're still preparing and before they get reinforced. We can get away while they're off balance." She spoke with that tone of authority she developed during her brief command of the Stellaris, and everyone froze to listen. "Victoria, Irabik, Emma, get the kids out of the bunker and through that door." Inez pointed to a concrete pillar on one side of the building. "It'll take you to a tunnel. The tunnel connects this building to the launch control center next door. Outside of the control center should be a bunch of utility trucks." Corder started to interrupt, but Inez talked over her. "Load up the kids, drive onto the Saturn Causeway, and then go east until you hit the ocean," Inez said quickly. "Once you see water, go south alongside the beach until you see an old world military base. It's been abandoned for almost a century, but most of it is still sturdy. Get the kids inside and we'll all meet up there." Victoria, Irabik, and Emma broke off from the group. The other defenders looked around at the sound of deep, booming noises from one side of the building. "They're coming through," Maui said, scanning the wall with his smart glasses. "They're trying to breach the doors, west side." "They think we're going to wait for them to come inside," Inez said. "Let's use what little surprise we've got." Inez had no way of knowing how many enemies were stacked up on the west side of the VAB, but she did know they were using some kind of battering ram against one of the doors instead of passing through the garage door, which was wide open. She knew why. The enemy assumed that an open door was being covered, and that anyone passing through it would be shot. Today, assumptions would be lethal. "Flyers through the garage door," Inez ordered. "Keep the enemy looking everywhere but forward. Kingi, bring the front door down on our side. Carfu and Setla, raise fucking hell! Cassandra, put up another shield for as long as you can. Shout my name when you can't hold it anymore. Everyone else, push forward until Cassandra shouts my name. Then we break for the trucks and get out of here." Masking her own fear and terror beneath a layer of confidence and authority, Inez took one final look at Cassandra. The young girl's face was stony, unmoving. Then Kingi raised his rotary plasma cannon, spun up the barrels, and took aim at the west wall. He laid on the trigger and swept the weapon from side to side, spraying the doors, windows, and walls with hot plasma bolts. Confused shouting and panicking could be heard from the other side, but not for long. Kingi let go of the trigger and signaled his companions. The Muton and Mykor put their gargantuan shoulders to the wall. Carfu's body was so huge she never would have fit through the front door anyway. Everyone raised their weapons, ready. With a great heave, a whole section of the wall collapsed in a swirling storm of concrete dust and insulation fragments. At the same time, Honeydew, Lavender, and Maroon sailed through the garage door, firing plasma pistols down at the enemy below. "There they are!" Inez screamed. "Cut into them!" One more time, gunfire. Against all odds, Inez's plan had actually worked. Over 100 space rangers, waiting for their turn to enter and clear the VAB, were caught completely off guard by the sudden sortie. Men fell by the dozens as weapons roared in the darkness. Sectopods stomped around uselessly, unable to employ their devastating weapons without hitting their own men. The 26 defenders found themselves in a target-rich environment. Enemies were everywhere, scattering about as they ran for cover. Inez swept her laser rifle around, not even bothering to aim. In the chaos, she could have sworn she took a man's arm off with it. Up on the surrounding rooftops, additional space rangers raised their weapons and fired down into the attacking rescuers. Inez could see laser bolts streaking towards her from above, only to bend in midair and sail off in some random direction. Looking behind her, Cassandra was standing at the back of the group, her arms wide. She was panting with the effort of keeping the shield up, sweat staining her clothes. Like athletes in a foot race, the Stormbreakers charged the enemy, running them down. Setla tossed a space ranger through a second-story window like a toy. Quarter and Kingi advanced together, one blasting away while the other moved. Nainu rode on Maui's shoulders, covering the flanks with his laser pistol. The Wolverines fought as viciously as their namesakes. Lawrence, Jay, and Sarah closed the distance and engaged space rangers in hand-to-hand combat, seeming to ignore the fact that their opponents were wearing power armor. Lawrence smashed a man's helmet with his pistol before kicking him to the ground and stomping on his head. Sarah, spattered in blood, smashed a nearby window and used the broken glass as an improvised knife. Bradley and Emmanuel worked together, fighting as a single unit to bring down one enemy at a time in brutal fashion. Ted Navarro and Colonel Sharp used the terrain to their advantage, sniping the enemy from close range before vanishing into the smoke and fire again. The Cybon, high above, showed no mercy to the men on the rooftops. Inez heard a yell, a scream, and a loud crash as a fully armored ranger hit the ground. Several more followed as Honeydew, Maroon, and Lavender followed up their strikes. Munkustrap helped the avians, firing his laser rifle at rooftop fighters, revealing their targets to everyone on the battlefield. Carfu was in her element. She tilted her head back and let out a deafening, blood-curdling roar. It was the Blood Call, the traditional battle cry of the Muton people. Hearing the sound, several space rangers panicked, freezing in place or turning their weapons on anything that moved, often hitting each other. Carfu thundered into the fray like one of the old Muton berserkers. She punched a space ranger so hard his power armor shattered like glass. Pinning him to the ground, Carfu punched and slammed the man repeatedly, spraying blood and bones across the ground. Naveen Soban and Runhan Somtal stayed together, drilling through a whole squad of space rangers like monsters from the darkest of nightmares. Runhan wielded a large knife in one hand as though it was a sword, while Naveen wielded 2 submachine guns, one in each hand. The Higaran man looked almost happy to be part of such a chaotic scene. Meanwhile, David Sepulveda and the 4 UN defectors made a scene of their own. David, Rella, Shen, Tameen, and Dimitro stayed together, fighting as a squad, and their mere presence on the battlefield became a distraction for the enemy. several Space Rangers turned to face their former comrades, often with a dramatic cry of "Traitor!" David, Shen, and Tamine fought at close range with rifles and pistols, but Dimitro and Rella preferred to get close. Armed with arc blades and plasma swords, they engaged in intense, close-quarter combat that would have made a war-era XCOM Ranger proud. Sergeant Rella cut down so many men with her arc blade that her arms started to ache. In the midst of the unfolding torrent of violence, Inez could clearly see that her sister's efforts were paying off. The enemy pointed and fired their weapons at the rescuers, yet nothing seemed to connect. Plasma bolts seemed to fizzle out in midair, laser beams scattered as though hitting a prism, and Gauss slugs veered wildly off to the side, harmlessly hitting the ground. The enemy was simply unable to shoot any of the rescuers with their guns. And yet, with a horrible, icy feeling, Inez realized something terrible. Her ragtag team of rescuers were cutting through the enemy like a hot knife through butter, and Space Rangers were falling with each moment. But there never seemed to be any fewer of them. In fact, there were more of them now than when the fight began. These were new, fresh troops, and they had heavy weapons. Reinforcements had arrived. "Nazi!" Cassandra screamed. "Nazi! I can't!" Inez raised her voice to be heard above the din. "Everyone fall back! Retreat!" At that moment, the telekinetic shield collapsed. Inez actually felt the sudden shift in psionic energy as it happened. Cassandra's eyes rolled up to the back of her head and she slumped to the ground. Stooping as she moved, Inez grabbed her sister and continued back into the VAB. The others waged a fighting retreat, firing their weapons blindly into the enemy force as they withdrew. Just on the other side of the building, Inez could see the tunnel to the mission control building. Behind her there was a yell. "He's hit!" Inez looked around to see her father tumble to the ground. "Ah! Same fucking arm as last time!" Emmanuel cried out in pain, his right arm hanging useless at his side. Carfu grabbed Emmanuel and lifted him into the bridal carry position before charging towards the tunnel entrance. 2 by 2, the rescuers fled through the entrance. Inez stayed behind, waiting until all of her comrades were through before she stepped into the tunnel as well. Runhan Somtal and Ted Navarro were waiting for her. "Keep going," Ted told her. "We're gonna collapse the tunnel." Inez passed through the mission control building, following everyone to the parking lot outside. "When you said there were trucks, I was expecting civilian vehicles," said Maui. "This is perfect for us." Truthfully, Inez was also expecting to find civilian trucks here. Instead, about a dozen military vehicles were lined up in the parking lot, all painted in the blue and white colors of the United Nations Army, with the acronym AFUNE painted on their sides. Inez quickly counted 2 APCs, an open-top cargo truck, and 7 technicals, a pickup truck with a heavy weapon mounted in the bed. "Everyone load up," she said, then turned to Carfu and Emmanuel. Her father looked pale. Corder and Naveen had treated his injury by putting a tourniquet on his injured right arm, but Emmanuel still had a determined look on his face. "Dad, you need to take the lead vehicle," Inez said. "Let Carfu drive, and you guide everyone to that abandoned base." "Cape Canaveral Air Force Station," Emmanuel panted. "I know the spot. We'll get there." Inez, the Stormbreakers, and the Wolverines loaded up in the technicals. Setla was so large that he tore the machine gun off its mount and held it in both hands, making room for other passengers. Truck engines roared to life. Then, with Carfu and Emmanuel in the lead, the impromptu convoy sped out of the lot towards the Saturn Causeway. At once, gunfire erupted. The escaping rescuers were being shot at from nearly all directions, as both Space Rangers and base security realized what was going on. Everybody who could returned fire, sending plasma and lasers into all of the surrounding buildings. Oh, holy Jericho, here come the sectopods! Nainu yelled, pointing out from his perch on the cargo truck. Inez, sitting in the rearmost technical, turned to look around. All 9 of the massive robots were following the escaping rescuers, standing at their full height and taking 50-foot strides. From one of the other technicals, David shouted, "Open up the boxes in your trucks! We've got heavy weapons!" Inez looked around the bed of her truck and found a long, thin box. Cassandra and Corder were sitting on it. They both moved and helped Inez open it. Inside were 2 blaster launchers, a type of shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. Inez and Corder each took one and braced themselves against the metal frame of the truck bed. They tried to take aim, but Dimitro called out from the driver's seat, "Sharp turn!" Inez and Corder were forced to lower their weapons as the convoy turned onto the Saturn Causeway. The escaping vehicles had departed the Kennedy Space Center and were now driving along a causeway that led directly to the historic launch pad 39A. On either side of the road, trees whipped by at high speed as the trucks accelerated, but the sectopods lengthened their strides and closed the gap. Corder raised her blaster launcher and fired. A shimmering globe of green plasma sailed away and missed the enemy entirely. The resulting explosion was so large, it briefly lit up the nearby mushroom cloud in stark relief. On the back of the cargo truck, Irabik's Batera turned around and fired its railgun over the pack of technicals. Unlike Corder, the Batera struck true. The railgun slug flew low, striking a sectopod not on its rectangular head, but on one of its narrow, 50-foot long legs. The sectopod, suddenly losing one of its 2 legs, lost balance and toppled over, crashing into another sectopod and taking it down as well. One shot had taken out 2 highly dangerous enemies. Irabik cheered just as loudly as everyone else. There were now just 7 sectopods in pursuit. Feeling frantic, Inez looked around to her right and spotted the many towers and storage tanks of Launch Pad 39A. Now that she knew where she was, Inez recognized a new sensation: the smell of salt. Engines roaring and tires spinning, all of the vehicles turned hard to the left, following Titus Beach, south and away from Pad 39A. Just a short distance to the left, dark waves crashed against the shoreline. With a sense of building horror, Inez realized the 7 remaining sectopods were giving up the chase. The massive robots were turning to the south, and up above, Inez could see all 3 of the Prophet-class cruisers. The vessels were shadowing the convoy. Looking around, Inez also spotted a single Sky Ranger flying above the sectopods. In a moment, she understood what was happening. Someone flying over the scene had realized where the rescuers were going. Perhaps they'd even figured out where the kids had been moved. "Shit!" Inez swore out loud. "We've been made!" As if to confirm her words, the sectopods veered hard to the left and stepped off the road entirely. The giant robots started walking through the swamplands, pushing straight south to the abandoned military base where Irabik, Emma, and Victoria were waiting with the alien children. From here, Inez was not sure who would reach the base first, but either way, it was going to be very close. She had only moments to come up with a plan. "Honeydew!" Inez screamed over the noise of the wind. "Maroon! Lavender!" All 3 Cybon fighters answered her call. The trio of birds fluttered from one truck to the next, reaching her in seconds. "Fly ahead to the base," Inez instructed them. "Tell Irabik the enemy is onto her. Move the kids to..." Inez hesitated. There was nowhere left to run. The old world base had been the last safe place in the area. But Inez knew help was on the way. The rest of the GDF was out there, plus the whole of the UN. They just needed to survive. Inez racked her brains and came up with the final answer. "The lighthouse!" she said. "Move the kids to the Cape Canaveral lighthouse. It's a mile to the east of the base. You can't miss it. Just follow the runway leading out of the airport. Now go! Go!" The Cybon took flight and flew straight south, crossing over the marshland where trucks could not drive. Looking around, Inez realized the sectopods were being slowed by the swamp terrain. The Cybon were going to win the race. But in the back of her mind, Inez knew the sectopods would still reach the base quickly. They might even arrive as the kids were being evacuated. For the first time that night, Inez felt a sense of impending doom. Unless something happened to stall or stop those sectopods, none of the rescuers would survive long enough for real help to arrive. The rescuers arrived at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station a few moments before sunrise. Erebik, Emma, Victoria, and the Cybon trio were already evacuating the alien children. Walking in triple file lines, the kids were moving out of a reinforced bunker and climbing onto the same trucks they arrived on. In the distance, a yellow light appeared at the top of a dark tower. It was the Cape Canaveral lighthouse. "There's an old world bunker near the lighthouse," Emmanuel said. "The Americans used to store missiles in there, but Advent emptied the place out." Emmanuel and Inez looked up to see the trio of starships in the sky above. "They're watching us," Inez said. "They can see our every move, and they're wire guiding the sectopods right into us. They'll be here in just a few minutes." Inez looked up at the sky again. "The GDF Armada is still up there," he said. "We've just got to hold out, you know that. Hold out until they get here." Inez nodded grimly. She had already made up her mind. "Yeah, I know," she said. "I've got a plan for that." One last time, the 29 rescuers and their charges moved out. The United Convoy now consisted of 15 military trucks loaded to the brim with terrified children. In the back of one technical, Inez tightly squeezed Cassandra's hand and felt her own heart racing. She knew what needed to be done. The enemy needed to be stopped, or at least made to slow down just long enough for help to come. There was a simple and easy way to do this, and Inez knew all 28 of her fellow rescuers would immediately volunteer for the grim task. But she could not ask them to do that. She would not. None of them deserved what was waiting at the end of this road. As the convoy turned onto Lighthouse Road, orange lights spilled over the Atlantic Ocean. Christmas morning brought a gentle warmth to everyone it touched, except for Inez, who was as cold as ice. Cassandra squeezed Inez's hand and asked, "Are you okay? Your mind is all dark." Inez leaned over and gave her sister a tight hug. "I'm okay," she replied. "It's almost over. Everything will be all right soon." Then the technical reached the turn in the road. It slowed to a near stop, waiting for one of the trucks to turn ahead of it. About 30 alien kids were peering over the railing, trying to see the sectopods, which were closing in again. In that instant, where the truck was almost stopped, Inez summoned the last of her willpower. With a single, smooth movement, Inez jumped out of the truck and onto the road, taking with her a blaster launcher. The Shadowkeeper was still strapped to her leg. Cassandra screamed and reached out to grab her sister, but Inez just said, "I'll meet you up ahead," and watched as the truck drove away. Each vehicle in the convoy went around Inez. A few of the kids and rescuers called out to her, but Inez did not say anything. She only had eyes for Cassandra. As they drove past, Victoria, Erebik, Lawrence, and Emmanuel all had looks on their faces that said they understood what was about to happen. Inez watched the convoy until it was out of sight, turning into a road which was shrouded by trees. Mouth dry, stomach clenching, Inez turned to face the thundering sound of oncoming sectopods. Staring up the road, Inez could see everything coming towards her. 7 sectopods, 3 star cruisers high above, and a single Sky Ranger closer to the ground. And all she had was a rocket launcher and a single round of ammunition. Not enough to stop the enemy, but enough to slow them down, perhaps for just the right amount of time. But even if she succeeded or failed, Inez knew one thing for certain. I am about to die. She wished she had found the strength to say goodbye to Cassandra. She wished she had not put together this hasty rescue attempt. She wished she had waited for the rest of the GDF or Jericho to show up first. So many wishes and regrets filled her mind, until at last Inez pushed them aside. Instead, she thought about why she was doing this. Inez thought about how those kids would get to go home. Some of them were kidnapped back when this war started, 2 years ago. So many families would be reunited. Akira would lose the ability to test out her psionic weapons on non-humans. The next Amadio might very well be delayed because of this. In fact, without her experimental psionic soldiers, Akira's whole plan to reconquer Earth was shot. These thoughts gave Inez new strength. With her final act, Inez knew she would damage her mother's plans irreparably. In fact, this could be the complete undoing of the paradox forever. Inez could live happily in that knowledge for the next few minutes. The sectopods drew closer. One of them finally noticed her and lowered its Gauss cannon, ready to fire. The Sky Ranger swiveled its tilt rotor engines and began to hover over the scene. Even the cruisers high above seemed to have slowed down and were hovering as well. All of the enemy's eyes were on Inez. As Inez lifted her blaster launcher and rested it on her shoulder, she felt a familiar sensation. Psionic energy washed over her body, enveloping her completely. It felt like the warm and comforting embrace of a family member. A smile crossed Inez's mouth. "Cassandra, I love you," she breathed. And then she squeezed the trigger. The blaster launcher went off with a mighty crack, and a moment later, the foremost sectopod stumbled and fell over backwards. Its head hit the road surface and was smashed to bits, leaving the giant robot as nothing more than scrap metal. Her rocket launcher now useless, Inez dropped it to the side and unholstered her Shadowkeeper. She raised the pistol, aimed at the Sky Ranger, and fired. The weapon expelled a thick cloud of black smoke. The early morning wind quickly blew the smoke away, reminding Inez just how alone she was. Aboard the Sky Ranger, an atmosphere of shock filled the cabin. Rafi Bakir was at the controls, flying the troop transporter. Behind him, Klaus Eberhard, Sidney Bouclair, and Akira Robinson had all dropped their jaws. The XCOM commander looked down at the 6 remaining sectopods in shock. In his hands, Commander Eberhard was holding a tablet computer. He had been using it to take remote control of the machines below, and for a brief moment he had stared through the eyes of a sectopod directly into Inez's face as she fired the blaster launcher. Admiral Bouclair shook her head in disbelief. There's no way she can do that again. We should just order the sectopods to go around her, she commented. Akira peered over Rafi's shoulder, examining the scene below. Wait a moment, Akira said. At that instant, the smoke screen from the Shadowkeeper was blown away. The four men and women could see that Inez Espinosa was no longer alone. Everyone could see a second person next to her. There was a moment's pause as everyone realized just who the second person was. Akira went pale. When she spoke, her voice contained a faint trace of fear. I want every gun we have to fire on those women. Inez did not see where the other person came from. She did not hear their approach. It was as though the newcomer had simply popped out of the ground. This was the single most beautiful girl Inez had ever laid eyes on. She was a mixed-race person, no older than 21, with vaguely Asian features. She had brown skin and wavy hair that was dyed blue. Her round face was set by vivid purple eyes and a gentle smile. Inez knew she was looking at Jericho. Not the old woman the Stormbreakers found in Arcadia Bay, no. This was Jericho in her prime, as she had been during the last war, 50 years ago. She was even wearing the same iconic yellow shirt and blue jeans. Jericho did not say anything. She reached out and took Inez's hand. The two women stood shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, and stared up at the Sky Ranger. And then the 6 remaining sectopods opened fire. Gauss cannons and laser weapons raked the ground, causing Inez and Jericho to vanish in a cloud of smoke and debris. A second later, all 3 of the Prophet-class cruisers followed suit. Mass driver rounds, railgun slugs, space torpedoes, energy cannon blasts, plasma bombs, and ion beams rained down on Inez and Jericho. The bombardment was vicious and accurate, lasting for a full 30 seconds. It only stopped when the Archangel arrived. 15 small starships reached the scene by following the light of weapons fire. Aboard the JSDF Archangel, Chris Wright and Randall Murphy watched the destructive downpour play out from the cockpit. Himawari, connected to the ship once again, scanned the area quickly and confirmed the trio of cruisers were the only opposition. Holy God, Chris breathed as he watched 3 star cruisers mercilessly pummel an area no bigger than a car. Everyone lock and load, Randall called out. The Allied starfighters rose into an attack formation and accelerated to full speed. Himawari gave the weapons-free signal. Squadron, we are weapons hot, a Partogan pilot said over the radio. Birds away! Friendship 7 on your starboard, chimed in a Blorg pilot. Weapons hot, birds away! All 15 vessels opened fire. Missiles screamed across the early morning sky and struck the unsuspecting cruisers. Zoroaster lurched so hard to one side, she accidentally shot and destroyed 2 more sectopods on the ground. Chris and Randall maneuvered the Archangel to cut across Zoroaster's axis and draw her fire. I've got tone, Chris yelled. Target lock, birds away! 2 missiles and a plasma bomb connected with Zoroaster, severing one of her ion cannons. The weapon fell away from the starship, heading for the ground. On its way back to Earth, the ion cannon crashed into the tail of Akira's Sky Ranger. The troop transport went into a flat spin, swirling in a vortex of white smoke. With its engines screaming, the damaged Sky Ranger hit a grove of trees turned over and crashed into the ground.